You there?
I am indeed.
Okay. Keeping us on the edge there, coming in at the last second.
No, I've been here for a while. It's just connected right now.
Okay. How have you been in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, all good, man. Yeah. Just trying to get out of this whole coronavirus thing. It's just like so yesterday, you know, like want to get on with life in a way.
Yeah, I think we've still got another 6 months of it to go yet. Though.
I think so. I think the predictions are right that we haven't quite seen the primary wave of it. And you look at those exponential numbers on the news. How, you know, every day it's like binary increases. You know, 2 to the power of n, just like increases and increases. And things. Oh shit! This ain't a good thing.
Yeah, that's only the cases we know about as well. I've got a suspicion that there's at least that amount again that we don't know about.
Indeed. I don't
stressful times.
Special times. I don't think we can stay away from it for too long. Sooner or later, it's gonna come our way. You just hope you've got a robust enough immune system to deal with it. You know, otherwise, part of the pruning. You know.
Gaia getting its own back.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, we'll just wait a few more minutes for other people to join. 42 already. It's a good number, that.
It's a good number. I see we get, on one of these, we've had up to like 300 views so far. Once it gets onto the internet, then people seem to go and watch it in their spare time. You know?
For those of you that have joined already, I'm just going to wait another minute to let any latecomers attend, and then I'll hand over to Tom. Almost.
It's the lizard that gave it away, I think.
Yeah. Did you get the memo, Anna? Okay. To continue Tom's series of talks on stress and coping with it, I see he's going to talk about meditation, which I think can take in a number of different forms. And my forms are hiking and scuba diving. I find those two very meditative processes. I'm sure you're going to talk about some different forms as well of meditation. I'll hand over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Pete. This morning, only after I got dressed, I looked at the sort of slightly green shirt and I thought, oh my goodness, if it's green enough, it's going to blend with the background and turn into waves. And that'll be sort of trance-inducing of its own. But I see it's of a slight blue color, so I got away with it this time. Let me just share a screen. I've got 3 tiny, very easy slides just to share, or maybe even just 2 of them. And the first slide is this one. Just want to give myself a pen here. That's the pen I want. We live in a world of stimulus. It's quite an interesting and sobering fact to think that this brain of ours, since the day we were born, has never, ever, ever seen the light of day, not unless it's had a hole drilled in it or the top of it taken off for some reason. But this brain is just encased in this bony shell, and inside this enclosure of it, of itself, it itself has no idea what the outside world looks like. The outside world is a complete and utter mystery. The only way that it can get a sense of the world that we perceive around us is through our five senses. We use those five senses as peripheral devices in order to bring signals to the brain, and then we interpret them. And somewhere inside this box, there is a part that puts it all together and gives us this illusion, I suppose, of being in the world and being part of this world. And part of that makes us feel very separate because we are beings that live in the atmosphere out in the air. We don't really realize that we connected with each other via this medium called air. Here on the property where I live, we've got some koi ponds, thanks to Barbara Burns, who many years ago gave me a couple of koi. We've now got a thriving community of koi fish. And I was looking and feeding those fish not so long ago, and I wondered, are the fish as oblivious of the water in which they live as we are oblivious of the air in which we live? Because we think that we're separate, we think that we don't come in contact with each other, but yet there is this very tenuous, gaseous stuff that binds us together, that sort of interacts and sort of fills the gaps between us. And it would be curious if one could ask the fish if they were aware of the water in which they live. Maybe to them the water doesn't exist. They see themselves as separate entities and go about doing what they're doing. But the point is that the five senses are really there to pick up stimuli from the world outside: light, vibration, chemicals, force, percussion waves coming into the ears, the chemicals coming into the nose and mouth, giving us sensations of taste and smell, and energy, the warmth, the heat, the senses. These all land up somewhere on the peripheral devices, on the skin, in the eyes and ears, and then they travel through the neurology inside the body. And while those signals are propagating through the wires of the body, the neurons of the body, we have no idea that we are actually sensing those things. If I take my finger and I push this little probe into the tip of my finger, what will happen is that it stimulates the little receptors inside the finger. That's going to send an electrochemical signal down my arm, all the way up into the spinal cord and somewhere into the brain. And in my brain somewhere, I register this as an intrusion, as a sharp, not quite painful, but dull, achy sensation. And I also interpret it as having come from the finger. I feel the pain as if it were happening in the finger. But actually it's not. I have no awareness of that, none whatsoever, until such a time as it hits this place in the brain that we call the primary encoding. Somewhere inside the brain, complex mechanisms in the brain will register that sensation. And at that point, when those sensations are registered, we become aware of them. We feel them. We sense them. That's the word I'm looking for. What we do with that sense, that sensation, that stimulus, that awareness, is that because we are beings that can extrapolate ideas, because we can bring that idea to the forebrain where we can analyze it and strategize around it, we can create, after it is registered in the primary encoding layers of the brain, we can create interpretations of it. We can then talk about the sensation. But anything beyond the primary encoding spot in the brain where it is registered, where we become aware of the sensation, everything from that point onwards is really an abstraction of it. We're talking about it. We will embellish it and interlink it with other sensations and things and experiences that we've had. And those we might choose then in this here to encode that differently. We may say it's good sensation, or we may call it a bad sensation, one that we want to have more of, or one that we want to get rid of and have less of. So it's quite an interesting concept, that, and it's when I talk of meditation, and I'll come to that specifically in a moment. When we talk of meditation, we often think of it as some kind of yogic ho-hum, sitting crossed-leg position, very still, incense burning, and all those kind of things. But as Russell rightly said, it doesn't have to be that. And being a person who really quite needs a little bit of scientific evidence, empirical evidence, I need to try and understand this in terms of neurology in order for it to work for me. I know that other people can just embrace it, take it as a matter of faith. It works. But I need to understand how this works. And once I understand that, once I can grasp the underlying mechanisms of it, I can embrace it and use it more effectively in my own personal context. So the next slide that I have is very much along these lines. Let me just stop sharing this one for a bit and go to my next slide. And this is the one that I want to show you now. It's the same picture. It's just a little bit maybe more complicated, or in depth rather, let me say. So at the bottom of this picture down here, you'll see, oops, something went awry here. Sometimes these things drive on their own, and then other times they don't. Let me just get back to that slide. Pardon the little hiccup there for a bit, but I think we're back to that slide now. What I'm looking to do here again is just annotate so that I can draw on this picture here. In this part over here, we've got the 5 inputs, the 5 senses. We call them just for short VACOG. And VACOG is really just an initialism for visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, and gustatory. These 5 senses, what they are is they are the 3 first ones. These ones over here are the primary ones that most people use in order to encode their world. A lot of people are visual people, and you'll hear traces of that in their language. If you say to them, how are you feeling? They'll say, well, you need to see what I'm seeing, or you know, I have this gut feeling about something, or I hear what you're saying. And in their use of language and the use of some of the words that they use in their language, you can soon get an idea of whether they're visually encoded people, auditory encoded people, or touch. They encode their world through touch. Very few of us, we all do, but we don't really use smell and taste as ways of encoding the world, of making sense of the world, the input stimulus that we get from the world around us. As I said in the previous slide, as these sensations move through the neurology, we are unaware of them, and they must hit somewhere, this primary encoding level, somewhere in the brain, where we now get to that point of awareness. I use the example on the side of a lemon. The taste receptors in my mouth don't like lemons. I can taste them a mile away. And even now, if I just think of taking a lemon and sort of biting into the lemon, my salivary glands just already start secreting saliva into my mouth. It's a whole lot of neurological activity that takes place just with that lemon juice in my mouth. And when I get that taste in my mouth, I interpreted the primary encoding that happens there before I can put layers of thought around it is, ugh, this is sour. And I will then go through further layers of interpretation of this, saying I don't like lemons, but that's talking about this. This is an abstraction of that awareness. And then I might say, well, it reminds me of a time when I was teased and bullied at school, and someone pinned me to the ground and poured lemon into my mouth. And it reminds me of that time that I was bullied. And that puts me in a state of anger and despair and revenge. And so each time I take these things and I talk about another layer, another meta layer, I go into another higher level state around this. So the sour is the feeling that I get. It's the primary encoding. It's part of my biology. Every animal would have a sensation of its world somehow. But as humans, the word, the idea of I don't like lemons or I don't like the sour taste is talking about this sourness itself. The one above it, it reminds me of being bullied, is talking about the fact that I don't like them. It's a higher order extrapolation. And this puts me in a state of anger and seeking revenge, speaks about the bullying. It doesn't really speak about the sourness anymore. And so when we live in this world, we call all of these things above this red line of primary encoding, we call them perceptual schemas. Well, that's my interpretation of them. That's my word for them. And that comes from my computing days, because a schema is a database. From that word, we derive the word schematic or drawing. It's a collection of interrelated ideas that form our perception, and that perception of the world becomes my reality. It is my world. This gives me my personal frame of reference. It has everything to do with my culture, with my religious beliefs, how I see myself integrated into the world, the universe around me, how I see myself as being part of that universe, is all through these extrapolated layers in this perceptual schema of the brain. So let's get back to the idea of meditation and what meditation or mindfulness is trying to achieve. And we need to maybe go back to an analogy of computers. I'm around long enough to be a generation of computer geeks that never had a PC. It was only much later in life when we saw a personal computer. And those very early computers, they still happen, but to a far lesser degree today. But in the early versions of Windows, if you opened up too many windows, then it would slow the processor down. And I remember it got to a point where you try and move the mouse cursor across the screen and the mouse cursor would just go in little jerks because everything was so overloaded. Window upon window, there were too many tasks that were running. Things were happening in the background that we couldn't see. And after a while, there was nothing else you could do with those old tin encased PCs other than to stretch out your fingers and do the 3-finger salute. Control, Alt, Del, reboot the thing, and it would flush out all of that memory, and then it'd be kind of reasonably fast again. There's a friend of mine, she's an elderly lady, and she does pretty well with tech, but one thing she hasn't learned is she hasn't learned to close down tabs inside her browser. And so the other day, I think she uses Firefox. Firefox had just ground to a halt. Nothing was happening anymore. And when I went to help her, she had something like about 800 tabs still open. Everything that she'd ever browsed, she just opened a new tab and went to look for things. And they were all scrunched up on the side, and that was why the browser just wasn't working anymore. So when we live in this sea of stimuli, in this ocean of stimuli in which we exist, what happens here is that the world can send stimulus to us. If you think today we're aware of coronavirus, and we're not only aware of coronavirus that's happening around us, we're aware of it in every corner of the world. We've watched the track of this thing starting in China, and we see how it's landed fair and square in America and in Brazil. And we have all of this information and all of the fear and the anxiety and the uncertainty of the future. All of this world context is now sitting inside the brain, whereas before, in the days of the old tin PC, we never had a connection to the rest of the world other than maybe through print media. The connection we would have had with the coronavirus, had it have happened back then, would have been a parochial one. It would have been a localized one. I would have known about people maybe not being able to come to work and what that would have to me, or I may have learned of a distant relative or who had died from the virus. And it may have affected me, as just a couple of weeks ago did when my mom died. She contracted the virus, and that took her out. So we would have had that experience, and that would have been enough to deal with. But now we're starting to deal with things on a global level. We worried about global contexts and global economies and future and travel and interaction. We've pushed ourselves into tech, which is a good thing, into a globalized world, into a global civilization. And that world in some sense has shrunk, but we've also absorbed all of this, and we have created now perceptual schemas that really hold us captive sometimes. And these create a huge amounts of stress. And we've seen that when we create stress, when we have stress created in the brain, because we absolutely overloaded, we like one of those old PCs that's got no more disk anymore. It's got no more memory. It's trying to do this ballet dance on a 5-cent piece. It just can't function anymore. And that happens with us too. And what we've spoken about in previous webinars is that our tendency is to look for coping mechanisms. We go out and look for other things, and we self-medicate. And all of those previous webinars were about how we get stuck in habits, how that can lead to addictions, and how, in that very last webinar of ours, how the pathway that we have to take once we're stuck in extraordinary destructive habits and addictions, what kind of a pathway we need to follow in order to get out. The big question comes in, how can we prevent this from happening? How can we take control of this brain? Does your brain own you, or do you own your brain? And the whole idea of mindfulness, of meditation, is that the brain is not something that owns you. You actually own this instrument. And you can, through practice, through discipline, you can start to close down, shut down some of those open windows, those open tabs that this friend of mine had open. And the more you can declutter, the more you come back down to that primary level of encoding, the better this world becomes in terms of your ability to manage it. So part of that idea of mindfulness, and that's where those cliched pictures of sitting cross-legged and spine straight up and eyes closed all comes from, with soothing music in the background and all of those kind of things. It's iconic, and it's maybe the epitome of it. It's the ultimate destination in terms of meditation or mindfulness. But what can we do just in a practical sense? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to try and close down some of the input stimulus. So it would make sense that if you shut your eyes somewhere along the way, you just closed your eyes, you're not going to get that visual stimulation coming in. And since it is one of the primary of these three primary encoding mechanisms, it means that while you're sitting with your eyes closed, the brain will slow down a little bit. It doesn't have to process all of that new stimulus. It's hard to make the place very quiet, and I suppose that's why either headset with some other quiet music, some soothing music, would work for you, or to find a nice quiet place to go to would help shut out, again, some of the input stimulus. And I guess sitting still as you can be, will again reduce the input load, the bandwidth of data flowing into the brain. What we need to then do is we need to turn this around, and we need to start to collapse some of that thinking. And so after a while, if I just go and sit still, if I just go and stare at one spot, I'm sort of, as I'm talking now, I'm just looking at, I could look at this little clock that I see at the top here, and I could just focus my attention on that clock. And you may want to just try this with me. Just look at that clock as I speak, and notice it's a little clock where the second hand doesn't really move, and it seems to be about 11 or so. But as you look at it, notice what happens in your neurology. Notice how your mind may go through a little moment of anxiety, a little bit more, it gets a little bit more anxious, because what we're used to doing is we're used to looking around the room. We take little pictures, lots of little pictures, and we stitch them all together into one composite picture. And the picture of the room that you see around you that you think is in perfect focus is not really a room in perfect focus at all. It's the macula in the eye is a very tiny part where it can get really a focused image. And it goes and it takes this collage, this montage of all these little images, stitches them together, holds that image in the brain. And the longer you hold that image just in your memory, the more that memory just fades. And so the urgency is to go and look around to compose that picture, to look for differences, to create that mental pattern going. And so as you look at that clock in front of you and you hold your attention on that one place, the first little wave, if you notice it in your own body, first wave is a wave of anxiety. I want to look somewhere else. I want to be able to look at my world, but not just sitting, just looking at this thing. And after a little while, that urgency to look around passes, and you sit just looking at that little clock that doesn't move, and your brain lets go those layers of perception and starts to collapse down towards your primary encoding mechanism. Then you might start to hear, while you're still looking at that clock, you might start to hear other things. I've got some studio lights here just to give some side light, but they've got fans in them, and I can suddenly hear the fan, which I wasn't aware of before. Or as I start to go quiet, I'm starting to widen out. And we know that here in the primary in the neurology of the body, before we go into primary encoding, we can deal with 40 million neurological inputs per second. That's how much data is flowing into the brain. But we're so busy in the forebrain analyzing it and abstracting it and correlating it and entering it into the database and doing database management that we miss all of this that's coming in. We very seldom sit on just the primary encoding. So the idea with meditation is to get to a place where you can still your mind, where you don't allow these thoughts to happen, the abstracted thoughts, the perceptual thoughts, where you can allow those thoughts just to still and quieten until finally what you're doing is you're sitting fully aware, fully present in a world where you are with the sensation of the world and not the abstraction of the world. And that's a very manageable place. And if you think of Eckhart Tolle, some of you might have read Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. This again is that cliched place of now. It's in the moment. It's what's happening in the body right now. It's a very, very fine starting point. It's a point where you've started to take control of the mind. It might not be the most magical and best version of meditation and mindfulness that you could achieve. With practice and with repetition, you can get to master this in a way. But it's a fantastic starting point. So what I'd like to do, since I don't want to rush these things, and it would be inappropriate to sort of try and do that right now. In our next webinar, what I'll try and do is I'll try and lead you through that process. I needed to just give you the background today of what this is about and to show you that it has good, solid roots in science, in neurology, and in one's biology. But next time around, having got this picture, we'll then see what can you do? Just simple things, little tricks that can just still the mind down and ground you, bring you back down to that grounded level of primary encoding, where you're just aware of the feelings of what's arriving in your body. You're putting no interpretation to it. You're not analyzing it and saying it's good or bad, it's right or wrong. It just is. And if we can get that far in the next webinar, then we're on the path to prevention, rather than where we've been looking in the past as to how do we cure things that have already broken. Back to you, Russ.
Cool, thanks a lot, Thomas. Are there any questions from all the attendees? Doesn't seem so.
That's just cool.
Cool. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Yeah, you're welcome. For some of these maybe new what I struggled with when I first started with this, Russ, was I ran up against kind of dogma and religious issues and things, and it sort of really put me off for a long while. That's why I had to sort of get to this place of trying to understand it from a science and neurobiological point of view. And once you can feel comfortable with that, we can play with this as a technique rather than trying to go into some kind of shoo-wah place. If that makes sense.
It does. Cool. Thanks very much, Thomas.
You're so welcome.
Thanks everybody who attended. Cheers and have a good day.
Thank you.
And that's everybody gone. Thank you very much, Russell.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Nick, for arranging everything.